I'm thrilled to speak about Phyllida today. One of the, I don't know whether you know, I was the director of Tate Modern, and I'm kind of in the transition of stepping away from that directorship. And one of the things that I had really been looking forward to in my liberation, and really it was I never spoke to it about anybody, but I really thought that I would like to work with Phyllida again, and in a more curatorial role, and not in this way. And it is difficult when you're talking as a curator and art historian about an artist whose career was not finished. And in a way, most artists have the luxury of their final years. And often artists during those final years do really dull things. Their work, diminishes and they get repetitive, or sometimes they have a kind of final fling. And I think with Phyllida, as you can see from this exhibition, there's no closure. The work was really still at an incredibly experimental stage, which is really extraordinary for somebody in their late 70s, and I think speaks both to Phyllida herself, but also her career trajectory, and we'll talk about that. But she was still questing. She, in a way, had this momentum in her life in her 60s that other people, particularly now, get in their 40s, and she was really hardwired to take all those opportunities. But I do also know that she was looking forward to pulling back from the big projects and going back to the studio. I mean, all different, artists practice in different ways, but I think Phyllida's work in the end is really deeply embedded in a more kind of private, reflective studio practice that, in a way, goes right back to her formative years. In preparation for this event, I read through a few weeks ago. I was staying in Bodmin Moor, which is like the end of the earth in England, a very rough, uncultured place. But I was reading the interviews that we undertook maybe almost 10 years ago. And there was so much unfinished in our conversation. Phyllida always spoke so much that in order to get through the conversation, I'd endlessly had to interrupt her to ask the next question, aware of the time. And she would say things like, "Frances, you look hungry." And I'd say, "I've only got another half hour." But this interview, so many times I interrupted her, seemingly at the moment of revelation. So I think I'm going to spend the rest of my life thinking what those revelations might have been. But, I was also struck at that time, when you finally visit an artist at home, it's always so interesting. Sometimes you just visit an artist in their studio, which is a kind of an amazing thing. But when you visit them in your home, it's fascinating. I was really struck by the way real life just intruded all the time. So there was me interrupting her, but then there was the doorbell would ring. It was a hamper from Hauser, huge hamper. So then we talk about Hauser and Christmas, or Fabian would come in to share the publication of a poem, and that was another brilliant diversion, definitely a diversion. And then a grandchild would arrive back noisily from school and throw their bag down, and they'd be in a mood and they'd need something to eat. But it was kind of hilarious. So we had a particularly hilarious conversation over several days where Phyllida was doing some weird experiment with soil, trying to kind of get a material that she hadn't got before, and it was a disaster. But she was somebody who turned disasters into comedy in some ways. I'm sure it wasn't always like that. But I remember, Fabian, you remarking to me that you were a cook that always needed a recipe, but Phyllida could just throw stuff together. And, in art, as in life, as in cooking, Phyllida was somebody who always just was able to juggle all those balls and keep them all in the air. And in a way, now they've landed. And so for those of us who she leaves behind, the pleasure and the pain, in a way, is in sifting through and reflecting and seeing what we can make of it all. And we all will make different things. And I feel sort of quite exposed talking about Phyllida's work with colleagues of hers from other areas, and her husband, who of course know much more about Phyllida than I do. And we all know Phyllida in different ways. So the things I say are, entirely open to question, and they may chime with your thoughts, or they may be new things. But I think one of the things about Phyllida's work is that every encounter chimes with something from the past, but every encounter there's something new to discover, which is the joy of it. I wanted just to begin. I don't even need to. You're going to see the work. You have seen the work. You know this extraordinary piece. But I just wanted to really flag that, in a way, this sort of. At the time of her death, she was working brilliantly in two very different kinds of spaces. And this, of course, is the deeply encultured space, this beautiful building, this parkland, and so inscribed within it the history of her time, the art that she grew up with. And I can imagine that she felt really comfortable here, really in a womb-like space full of the art, the kind of art that shaped her vision. But at the same time, she was also working in lower Manhattan, in a really brutally raw urban space. Not her country, but the origin country of much of the art that she encountered after working through Phylida's legacy in the minimalism of American art, as America became ascendant in the Western art world. And here she had an opportunity that generations of sculptors have had the opportunity to do public sculpture. And what I just think is wonderful about these sculptures is the anti-monumentalism, I can't pronounce that word. They're not monumental. They challenge the whole history of sculpture. And so between these two projects, there's a sort of deep mediation on the history of her time, but the bigger wrought history of the history of sculpture. And in both projects, these works here and the works in New York, they are in themselves reflections and reinventions of ideas and images and techniques and that she had had many years beforehand. And I think that's one of the very striking things about Phyllida's work that reminds me of the great Louise Bourgeois, who also was such an inspiring role model for Phyllida, that the works visibly connect to their past. So as Louise Bourgeois, you always put it, I do, I undo, and I redo. And that seems to me very importantly the rhythm of Phyllida's work. And so what's visible in all these works is a kind of recycling. So each exhibition becomes a kind of palimpsest of earlier pieces. And Mireille, we were just talking about how this space will feel when the work is gone. But the works will kind of exist as ghosts in the space. And you, as you visit, will see them and they will resonate with other projects here. And when we see Phyllida's work in other spaces, it will connect through the sort of, what do we call it, the sort of, the ethereal worldview, the stuff out there that connects us over time. But I think the other thing about this project and the New York project was Phyllida's ability to choreograph space. And what's interesting, I think, here, and she must have seen in Phyllida, here's a space it's about Phylida's work inside, but also his work outside. So Phylida's played on that, So I don't know whether the works outside escape from this space or the works inside kind of crash land from outside. But there's that wonderful sense of transparency. And of course, in New York, it's a different kind of landing. These feel like they have landed from space. They're kind of foreign beings occupying this space. Ungainly sculptures. And in fact, recalling these very early, short-lived experimental works that Phyllida made in the 90s. I think one of the things to say is that Phylida's work, although embedded in those histories, was so incredibly independent of any particular school or fashion. And I think it's worth saying when you see these works in the moment of now, and with the explosion of multidisciplinary practice, they still relate to they're very much grounded in almost a sort of traditional history of modernism. She's still, for all her liberation, Phyllida was always stuck in that box. She was tearing it down, she was repositioning it, but there was this wonderful reference point. And for those of us who are interested in art history, working with Phyllida, it's almost impossible to see the history of modernism the same, having seen it through Phyllida's eyes. I first met her in around 2010, and she just stepped down from being Professor of Fine Art and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Slade in London. And I was not a specialist in British art, so I confess I had not followed her career, the career that had been pretty invisible. But we first met to discuss Louise Bourgeois, and as I said, one of her great references. And I remember that first meeting staggered, I mean literally staggered by her knowledge, not just her knowledge of, but her deep and continuing interest in the art of artists of her generation, but artists of her, what we'd call her peers. I mean, she stood on the shoulders of giants and acknowledged that, as well as the artists she learnt from through her curiosity and including several generations of students. And I think hers was a fascinating career arch. She trained at a moment of a kind of still European ascendancy. You think of that great post-war decade in European art. But there was a gradual tilting and quickening of the ascendancy of American art via abstract expressionism, then pop, and minimalism, and none of that would have been visible in the way that trends are visible now, but would have seeped into the consciousness through, rare copies of Art Forum or classic exhibitions like Arte Povera, or when attitudes became form. So there was a sort of rumors and a rumor mill and images and enticing, extraordinary things that were challenging everything she knew. And then she continued to pursue this very independent path through many years where conceptual art and then land art were really dominating the kind of scene and then, of course, the YBAs, a younger generation, much younger to Phyllida, absolutely taking center stage in the 90s. And what was interesting is that she continued to find absolutely her own way, unique journey, but that the journey was informed and really enriched by a very compelling and visual, and clearly acknowledged in the work and in her words, interest in and commitment to responding to her time and place in the world through the art. And so then my kind of understanding of Phyllida, or getting to know her, was partly about looking at works, but this was really just the moment when she began this very, very quick succession of amazing shows. But most of the previous work no longer existed. So it was very much a conversation with Phyllida looking at images, and we spent hours and hours going through the chronology of her work and talking about where it was made, what it was about. And that was because I was preparing a text for a monographic show, an installation she had at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh in 2015. And as I say, by then, Phyllida had really been propelled onto the world stage, and she had major gallery and museum shows, finally offering her the kind of stimulus she had obviously, probably dreamt about throughout her career, and no longer in the shadows. But much of what I can share with you is drawn from those conversations. They were completely fascinating, revelatory, often intimate. There were a number of occasions when she would tell me, what felt like deeply private memories and secrets, and I thought, yes, she is Louise Bourgeois. And then she'd send me an email saying, none of it can be known. But I don't think it was just because she wanted to keep secrets. I think it was because she felt very strongly that all of us have things that are private in our families, in our histories, our own experience, that we do want to keep private, but nevertheless they do inform the way we think about the world and the way we encounter other people. And she was very open that we all bring those memories to an appreciation of or understanding of our own lives and indeed her work. But we talked a lot about her student days, first at Chelsea and then the Slade. And I was brought up in an era where art schools were fantastically trendy, and I would love to have gone or been good enough to go to art school. I wasn't, so I went to university, but there was a sort of paradigm of amazingly creative, unusual places turning out extraordinary things. But of course, in those days, art schools were neither trendy nor really notably forcing grounds for innovation. And I think they were deeply, or at least the schools that Phyllida went to, deeply old-fashioned in a very dull kind of way. And she began her career, her learning experience in the painting schools. And I think this is really important. There's so much painting, so much curiosity about painting in Phyllida's work now, but she found the process of learning to paint in that environment claustrophobic. She found it impossible. And obviously the way she painted, the way she used paint, she found that her tutors were found incredibly challenging. So she transitioned early on into sculpture. But I think she always retained that memory of painting and a desire to challenge the history of painting and do things with paint, perhaps that other people hadn't done. It was a very strong motivating factor in much of her work, even I think in her early work. But really interesting to see the work here in this context, because when Phyllida went to art school, it was very difficult and impossible, I think, in some schools for women to train in metalwork. They were simply not allowed in the room. Women didn't use heavy materials. They didn't use the tools. So Phyllida was refused the kind of training that might have allowed her to work in the manner of Toledo. And I think her interest in artists who did use heavy metals and corten steel was partly driven by her own. It was a sort of the way she could engage with a material that she kind of found completely fascinating and compelling. And it's really interesting to see the little unfinished work here, where she's obviously really aspiring to work with heavy metal. But Phyllida did admit on many occasions that it was working at slightly old-fashioned sculpture studios at art school that really was her foundation, because in those days, when you learnt technique and you learnt skill. And Phyllida's work, for all its apparent de-skilling, and often it looks like just stuff that she's piled together, is supremely skilled. She understood how materials worked. She understood how you transform materials. She understood how juxtaposing, bringing two materials together could transform them both. And that came from deep knowledge. She loved to quote Picasso's maxim, "Before you use a nail, you must invent it." And of course, you can reinvent it. You can only reinvent something if you understand its origins, and that's what she did. And she, of course, was working, as I said, in the wake of an incredible generation of European artists. And the generation she most revered at those times, and we've often spoken about these artists, were what she described as ugly sculpture. The kind of post-war figuration, the kind of existential moment where it was impossible to depict the figure in the wake of the human slaughter of the Second World War, in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of, the nuclear threat. But still the figure remained central, and she felt passionate about the work of artists like Giacometti and Richier, who took materials like plaster and clay and used their hands to mold them into this kind of, malformed, ugly, but really representations of humanity whose forms retained the marks of the hand in their making. That Tate has a wonderful work by Jean Fautrier, the French painter and sculptor. She loved sculptors who also make painting. Another connection. Found that really interesting. We have a work in Tate's collection which is a figure which you can almost hardly see the figure. That's just the profile, but the marks of Vautrin's hands are in these sort of scratches across the skin, wounded. And I think that was that idea that you can, the tactile, the evidence of tactile manipulation that she learnt then never left her work, and is really evident in all the work in this show. But of course, at the same time that she was deeply engaged with those artists, she was also absolutely rejecting the figure, the representation of the figure itself in her own work. And I think that was partly because of the static nature of the figure. You know, Giacometti's was totally controlling about where you stood in relation to his work. 6 meters in front, to recall the way that he'd seen the prostitutes in the bar Sphinx in Montparnasse in 1947. Absolutely controlling. And I think Phyllida railed against that. And actually it was artists like Phyllida that she found inspiring, because the work simply could not be seen or appreciated from a single direction. So it was the idea that you had to move around, look from on top, that no single views. So there were people like Phyllida, but also the other huge reference at this time, I think, is surrealist sculpture. And the strong sense, not as surrealism as a movement, or as surrealism as a gateway into anybody's, dreams or private psychology, but I think it was the strong sense, the power of juxtaposition, of putting very different things together and creating a kind of charge. So, the way the mirror, the bulbous, erotic, and biomorphic protrusions that she found in Miro, but also putting things together in a way that's very, very disparate. And when 18 months ago, she won the Schwitters Prize, we had a long conversation about Schwitters too, because of course Schwitters is an artist that has not been talked about or referred to much in conversation, but of course I think he was a key influence, both writ large and his Merzbau, and these are very Merzbau-like, these works, because creating a new interior world through the work, but also these funny little small objects that Schwitters made when he came to England in the late 40s, which are very much about working kind of blind in the studio with no resources, that sense of invention, pitting things together and seeing what conversation comes out of it. But just coming back to Phyllida again, a little bit after this, it was a moment where Tate, and Tate was always a collection that Phyllida referred to. It's obviously the big national museum in the UK, but Phyllida's Modulations in Space was acquired by Tate in the mid-60s. It's a work from 1963. And many years later, when Phyllida was asked to talk about a work from the Tate's collection, it was really interesting, before this project was even dreamt about, I think, that she chose this work to make a sort of personal observation with, of all the works in Tate's collection. And what's nice about the text, which you can find online if you want to, is that she confessed she couldn't make it out. And I love that. She actually didn't really get it. And I think it's fine not to get Phyllida's work. It's not about it being about something in particular. It's about the journey of thinking and looking. And so what she was asking of this sculpture was questions. So is the work rising? Is it collapsing? Is it folding or unfolding? Is it exhaling or is it inhaling? And I think she found in it a sense of both a kind of ready-made form, because she saw in it, maybe it's a railway sleeper or something in the real world, but invented forms, but not just form. So it's not just its strong material presence. And she made a list in this description of the materials that it was made of, and they include iron, but also gravity and time. And time is hugely important to Phyllida. And I would add a fourth one to that. I would add space. And it's pretty amazing to be talking here in the presence of this great work, which is so much about all those things, but particularly space. But alongside that sort of so deeply self-reflective studio practice, she always spoke about, very generous about influences in art, but incredibly eloquent about influences outside art. And I don't know what, Fabian, your and Phyllida's life was like before you saddled yourself with 5 children, but there was definitely theatre and opera and cinema and poetry and literature. And I think Phyllida was embarrassed of her incredible knowledge, but and wasn't always wanting to talk about it, but she was incredibly generous in allowing it to feed into her work. And I did once ask her, what should I read to understand your work? And she said, Alain Robbe-Grillet. And I did, and I got it. But she often, beyond the kind of great art, she spoke to me really brilliantly of the sort of her love of slapstick, black and white, early cinema, silent cinema, and the kind of tragicomic, hilarious situations that you find in movies. This is Buster Keaton from that era. But also the kind of absurdism of Tom and Jerry. And I just think, the post-war era, the 50s and 60s, they were absolutely grappling. This was the era of the absurd. They were living in an absurd world. Of course, I think now too we are again very conscious of the absurdity of this planet that we love, but we live in a kind of compact to destroy it. So I think there was a kind of existential anxiety that also had a humorous touch in her work then and always. But I think you get the kind of contradictory impulses very clearly in a work like this. And when I first began to thought about this work, there are the sort of bulbous biomorphic things that Phyllida made her own in the early 60s. But here, what I loved about this is that it's combined with this very strong reference to the grid. It's the grid of modern architecture. It's a window, a classic proportion, but it's also the grid of minimalism. And this is the moment where New York is absolutely conquering the world with this strong geometry and the dominance of industrial materials. And a work like this seems to be a sort of like, yeah, let's take that seriously, but let's not take it so seriously, because there's also the world of nature and comedy and the body, and alongside the certainty of the rules of minimalism and geometry and art, there's also precarity and complexity and life and sex and death, of movement and solidarity and, you name it, liquidity. And holding those two things was, of course, incredibly, in a way, very radical at that time. And when I was talking to Phyllida, I was working, it just so happens, thinking about Phyllida, which was doing my head in, but I was also trying to work on Agnes Martin, which was another kind of brain freeze moment. And so I was always thinking about Phyllida's work through the lens of Agnes Martin, which is a very strange gateway, but one she was incredibly thrilled to discuss, or at least appeared to be thrilled to go with me on that journey. And of course, I saw Agnes Martin's grid paintings in this work, and of course, Agnes Martin arrived at her quintessential grid in about 1964. So there's an absolute sort of adjacency in their experience. And when I was thinking about Agnes Martin, whenever I think about Agnes Martin's paintings, I think about the need to look at them very, very slowly. And really, because you look and you think, and as you think, you see more, and you find different qualities in the work. But what was Phyllida countered that by saying, but slow looking isn't always good. It can be good, but what she really liked, and she was really interested in at that time, was how she liked people to move through the installations very, very fast. She cited Martin Creed's installation in Tate Britain's Duvines, and his work was literally a runner running through the space. Because what she wanted to do, she kind of loved this idea of an animated montage not through cinema, but through your body creating the montage. And she described it as a way of kind of countering or negating the pictorial, making it impossible to have that kind of fixed view, the kind of view that you have of a painting on a wall. As she said, we are all, after all, we're all bodies that move. And then she described it was kind of as a kind of restlessness, that there's a restlessness in all of us, and there's a restlessness in her work. And I thought at the time that was kind of both a kind of universal commentary, but probably something very personal, that she was a restless person, intellectually restless, vividly restless, but restless about, she, as I say, she juggled so many things, so many balls in the air. But, I think it's one of the things that I do find in Barlow's work, and I find it very much here, is the pleasure of being occupied by a single work, just a single work. And I think it's interesting that the reason that is the case for Phyllida's work is that it's not singular, that the way she uses materials and the way in particular she draws painting into a dialogue with sculpture it's a way of generating a conversation. And the grid here, I think, was a way of generating, even maybe it was subconscious, it was a way of bringing sculpture early on into a conversation with painting. So the grid has a front and a back, and that squaring up has been a feature of drawing, of course, since the Renaissance. And of course, in a much subsequent work like this project, she declares that, but I think it's very much nascent in this kind of early work. And over the years, all of us who work in museums and those of us who are, who love modern art have done a lot of thinking about the history of modernism, and particularly that canon of art. And we are living in a moment where we're kind of taking its toll in relation to gender. And, Phyllida was one of many generations of women who were excluded from that canon. And her way of working had no framework of reference within it. And that kind of outsider status, I think, is very strongly represented in this diagram. This is an amazing image for those of you who don't know it. It was on the cover of an important exhibition of Cubism that took place at the very recently opened Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1936, and it was a map of the history of modern art that was drawn by the director of MoMA, Alfred Barr, who was hugely influential on setting up the terms of reference that then governed much of the thinking about modern art in subsequent decades. And what it just shows you is that Barr identified two very distinct types of abstraction, which he saw, you can see at the bottom, as separate. They don't connect. They connect in the compost, their rootedness, but they develop in separate lines. And one line ends in geometric abstract art. So Mondrian, for example, the kind of absolutely pared back abstraction, Mondrian to minimalism. And the other is in a kind of non-geometrical. It's interesting that it's defined as a negative. There isn't a word for it, but it's everything abstract that isn't geometric. So it's the bulbous, the soft, the liquid, the sexy, the stuff that you see in those early works of Phyllida's. But of course, these two impossible trajectories are exactly what Phyllida refused to acknowledge. And I think all her work, right from that very beginning, kind of occupies a really interesting place in the slipstream between those two waves of innovation. So this White Room, which is a piece that Phyllida made as a graduate, is coming out of her student years, I think a really important landmark work for setting up so much of what was to follow. It's a work that continues to reference the history of art. There's a lot of minimalist stuff in it, but it's bringing that sense of art into the domestic realm. It's invoking the idea of the home in all its complexity, And we know that the home is where artists retreat after a day in the studio, but I think Phyllida's work itself was rooted in the home. And for many years, of course, it was the only place that she, having left the studios of the art school, it was the place that the space for work itself, for making and experimenting, but it was the place that she looked out from onto the world, where London, the landscapes of London invaded her home. And it's no surprise, I think, that from this period onwards, bits of furniture feature throughout her work that often references to domestic spaces and the things we use, the things that they're kind of almost like proxies for bodies, or they support our bodies, or they help us move around the space. On the other side of this, there's a balcony. It's a support structure for a person. It hangs off a building. There are corridors implicated, the sense of shelter, their walls collapsed. But so staircases are often used to articulate movement and connecting spaces to transition, to indicate speed. Windows open up views. Blankets determine shelter, chairs support. And of course, we've all lived through very precarious times, but looking at her work, and the many references here in this piece outside, there seem to be references to scenarios of damage, of areas to repair, bandages. And I think and certainly she talks about this, it's not incidental that her, I've missed out an image. Let me just see whether I can get to it. Have I lost an image? Oh, I've lost an image. Very sad. What I was going to show you was an amazing picture, I'll have to describe it, of a scene from bomb-damaged London. And one of the things that Phyllida admits as a really foundational memory was a visit to London just after the war, and a London that had spilled its guts as a result of bomb damage. So one would pass through areas where houses had literally disappeared, but they left traces themselves hanging off the walls of the ruins. So there'd be a wall with a bath hanging off it, or a toilet, and the remains of wallpaper. And I think that Phyllida, as a very young girl, was captivated by that, both the pain of it, but also this kind of almost sort of like the beauty of that and the surprise of it. And disasters do upend our houses. They destabilize our world, and that Phyllida's admitted a kind of fascination for that kind of landscapes of catastrophe ever since. But and you see that. Then coming through the way she explores minimalism. So even this shed mesh piece from '76, which is such a strong, and she acknowledges the reference to somebody like Tony Smith. She's taken Tony Smith's pure industrial dye and she's put it through a wringer. She's taken it apart, she's drilled holes in it, she's refabricated it out of waste material. It's a wonderful, we could spend hours talking about this work, its relation to minimalism, but also its relation to a painting, to the landscape outside. And sitting at her kitchen table and looking out at the street of her North London home, and later looking at the landscape in the railway yard, you can kind of see that she had a way of suspending judgment about what things were and allowing herself to absorb the physicality of those things, but also the multiple references that they inspired. So a kind of combination of a kind of deep objectivity and a really deep subjectivity. And I do remember we talked about how you look at things, and she, sitting at her front room table, she said, "What do you see out of the window?" So I looked out of the window and I saw a lorry backing up, a big lorry. It was a busy urban street, and the lorry had an advertisement on it for a kitchen appliance, and I thought it was funny because the advertisement was upside down. And then I asked her what she was looking at, and she said that she saw a large rectangle, and it was grey, and there was a smaller yellow rectangle inside it, and then she also saw that it was bifurcated by a strong vertical, and I realized that, you know, I was seeing the trigger object, and she was describing me in very kind of objective, formal terms what she really saw. And it was extraordinary, because then I looked at the table and I saw 2 yellow squares and a silver snake. And of course it was her massive memory banks for her computer and the wires. But there was this wonderful sort of, you could see the way her brain worked, and yet at the same time, as I said earlier, the phone was ringing, the grandchild arrived home. She was able to have this very intense separation. It wasn't even separation, but a kind of compartmentalization, an amazing mental filing system that then sometimes she allowed to collapse and intrude in all the work. But I'm going to speed up a bit. Phyllida left the Slade in '66, and for really most of her career combined teaching with parenting, as I said, an obscene number of children. Oh, look, there's the image. There it is. You know, and what is incredible is just how this guy looks like an image from a Buster Keaton film. You couldn't make it up. The precarity of real life. And to see the kind of just extraordinary fiction, the fact in the fiction in the fact. But her work for those years at home was fantastically grounded in the home. And I love these pictures of Phyllida in her studio, the mess of it. She often used that word stuff, and her working space is full of stuff, including her young daughter Florence is also a piece of stuff. Very bored by her mother's work. Extraordinary that she's turned into a remarkable artist herself. But you can see that much of her work over many decades was really studio work. I mean, there were some exhibitions, there were some commissions, but it was mostly propelling herself at home to make work that was not for sale. No exposure meant no market, but I think it was partly experimental, it was part therapeutic, where things can be done for absolutely no apparent reason, and I think that was always important to Phyllida. So many artists these days just work for commissions. They don't even begin a work till they have the commission on the table, but she absolutely believed in making do and getting by and everyday thinking and working. And she described, you know, things done for no apparent reason beyond what she described to me as a form of on and on caressing. And you got this feeling of a kind of love of her vocation. She loved to be in the studio. And in the late 1980s, she even experimented in working in the dark. So I think she was fantastically rigorous at setting up these exercises, experimental, working with the idea of touch, liberating your hands from your eyes, and exercises in chance, in hazard, and also then working with ways of making, wrapping. She wrapping, a collision. She made a work called wrapping. It was a collision between a verb and a noun. And you can see in these experiments really important elements that then you see in these works. Look at this folding and letting drop. Deeply, you know, tactile knowledge of materials. And I think one of her favorite strategies was to disrupt what you think you know about the work, about the material. So she always loved revealing something very unexpected but also true. The same as challenging a conventional statement about an interior or a surface. She loved pushing things to the limits, and she always responded eagerly to invitations to show work, but so often had to create her own. And I mentioned earlier that the projects in Lower Manhattan came from earlier projects, and probably driven towards insanity by not having an exhibition. Phyllida just had to set up her own terms of reference for taking work outside the studio. And so this series she made to place works in the street, like without invitation, and possibly without audience, or subsequently in the home of friends. And I think it was, as she said it, this was about just allowing herself to make objects, not for the studio, but for make significant things for other places, to have that, the luxury, if you like, of working outside the studio. And I think, she referenced the idea of Lautréamont, the famous poet, and who influenced the Surrealists when he talked about the beauty of the chance encounter between a sewing machine and an operating table. So the meeting of, we have the lobster telephone in Tate's collection by Dali, a telephone with a lobster on top of it. What do you make of that? So the functionality of one of the things is disrupted by the functionality of the other. They cancel each other out. And that kind of cancelling and paradox is, again, so much present in so much of her later work. And of course, again, working in the public realm, and then here working in private spaces. She was fascinated by interior space, and I love these works where she takes a domestic object and she basically destroys its function. You can't sit on the chair because it's occupied by this big thing that's a bit of wrapping and a bit of stuffing. Interesting that being drawn to the home. You see it in the piece out here, the kind of shelter. You see it in so much of work. And she spoke about this duality of loving outside space and inside space. And she talked in one of our interviews about her childhood games in the attic of her home, about making little dolls' houses and furniture made out of walnuts and matchsticks. I mean, obviously the origins of much of her later work. But also she talked about the fear of being enclosed and specific examples of when she had felt very claustrophobic. And I'm quoting from those interviews. She said, "I often wondered if my own phobias came into play, and I wonder where the sort of psychology of a fear of the unknown physically and psychologically makes me," that's her, "have a curiosity about these two different worlds, the outside world and the inside world." And it was after that conversation that she emailed me the next day and said, "Don't ever share this with anybody." So I won't. But I think she would allow that confession that these things were really important to her is very interesting. During the 80s, I'm going to really speed up, Phyllida made a number of interventions in the landscape. She was included in some very major projects, and this is a project where she was invited to make an intervention into a, sorry, I'm just going to find my notes, into a stone quarry in Dorset, Portland in Dorset, which was a site where this very beautiful limestone originated from. Limestone that actually was used in the building of much of central London, which has this incredible beauty, and there's a sort of beautiful, sublime neglect about this landscape. But of course, it was a quarry, and it was a place of industry and spoliation and extraction. And of course, Barlow did this amazing and wonderful and joyous intervention into it. And she found a vast quantity of waste plastic in yellow and blue, really ugly, horrible stuff, the kind of stuff that Phyllida loved. And she created a kind of lid over one of these dangerous holes, and a glorious clash of cultures at a time when, Britain was in a really poor state. So it was probably also a commentary on the world. It was called Fill, great. It was filling, fill, the conjunction of verb and noun. And I don't know who curated it, and Phyllida never told me, but when the curators found what she'd done, it was obviously just too vividly like a real landfill site of contemporary rubbish, and they asked for it to be removed. But I think it was very close to the reality of post-industrial Britain. And, you know, Britain was on the brink of social and political meltdown. It was a time of incredibly growing unrest. There was huge unemployment in the UK. There was the miners' strike, the Toxteth riots, and really big fears around environmental pollution and the threat of nuclear war. And when you look at the piece out here and you see the banners, that these are banners of protest that have been embedded, trampled into the work. This was the era when Phyllida would have seen banners marching down the streets in London. And I think it's not surprising. Oh yes, I wanted to show you this because this is a simultaneous work almost by one of Phyllida's contemporaries, Tony Cragg. And it's a very powerful work, but it's a much more literal representation of that moment in Britain. Here is a landscape spoiled by industrial waste, and it's being looked at from the north of England. Anybody who's read the papers today will know that even now the whole debate in Britain is about Britain not seen from the north. But, you know, this was a really angry time and a worrying time, and much of Phyllida's work from this time alludes in its titles and its use of these massive, huge quantities of waste materials to a sense of impending doom. So works called Wrecks, Storm, Engulf, they really evoke the kind of catastrophe catastrophic events in nature, and works like Tarpaulin and Slope suggest sort of spaces of provisional shelters in disaster zones. And I love this, again, this piece called Threat, and it really is threatening the world engulfed in a kind of a plastic pollution, raw fear. And it's not surprising that this is the moment that this was the kind of literature that the government was pushing out. This literature here, Protect and Survive, a public publication produced by the government instructing people how to prepare themselves in the event of a nuclear holocaust. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to see in some of these images, echoes of what Phyllida was beginning to do in her work. She was translating the domestic into the disaster scenario. Of course, from 2011, this is Phyllida''s first celebration, first work with the Commercial Gallery, Hauser and Wirth in London in 2011, and I love the pom-poms in the attic. Talked about she really wanted to take down the big and the mighty, and always was able to deflate even the most grandiose of commercial galleries. An amazing work. But working with Hauser and in this new moment of exposure, she was able to develop on a grand scale, and always using often using redundant and mundane materials. And I just really wanted to flag the work that she was working on when I did those interviews with her, and this was this incredible, I think it was her greatest work, honestly. Home City, Home National Museum, the museum that had kept her at bay for decades, but which had contained so much of the art that she loved and did not like. Home of Anthony Caro and the generation of sculptors that she was critiquing in her work, and yet at the epicenter in London of this vast industrial development on the south bank of the Thames at Vauxhall, which she found appalling and yet romantic and seductive in exactly the same way that she had found those visits to London in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it, again, just as this project sees the outside coming in and the inside coming out, what she created in Dock was a meeting of the kind of urban reality with art history, with a sense of challenging the pomp and circumstance of the museum. She, elsewhere in the Devine Gallery, she created these fantastic towers that were wrapped in brown paper, the kind of ordinary wrapping paper. And they were there to kind of critique and interrupt and challenge the kind of phallocentrism of these kind of Greek archetypal columns. And there was so much here about celebrating creativity, but also knocking the greats off their pedestals. And it was her moment par excellence. And it's impossible to go into that space without thinking about how she used the ceiling and how she took sculpture up and she hung it from the ceiling, and she took paintings off the walls and threw them into the floor. It was a wonderful reflection on her whole career and the legacy of British art and her love of the city and its fear of the future. Of course, working with international operations on a huge scale was costly too. Opportunities beyond Phyllida's dreams, but it really exposed, of course, the limitations of work, and it was difficult, I think, and she talked about this, really difficult at time to sustain that kind of self-reflective, private, meditative practice that she'd had for so many years in the studio. And I think she also felt conflicted by the constraints. I mean, there were opportunities, but real constraints of working on these big museum shows, that works had to be shipped out to America, that had to come to Spain or, to Germany. Things needed planning in advance. And when you have to plan work and create armatures and work with museums and their fantastically strict rules and structures and restrictions, where is the room for the spontaneity? Where's the room for making mistakes? Where's the room for taking an idea and running with it? And she was also conscious, of course, of the huge costs of shipping, of transport, and not just the financial costs, but the costs of carbon emissions. And one of her last works, which I was a little bit involved with, was this great project she made in Hanover, and it for the Schwitters Prize at the Sprengel Museum, which is the museum that really holds the legacy, like this holds the legacy of Phyllida. The Sprengel Museum holds the legacy of Schwitters, and boy, did she play on that idea. But she also used it, I think, that the legacy, the kind of the Schwitters' challenge to the museum in the Märzbau became Phyllida's challenge to the museum and the system in this work, which created a complete breach through the museum, impossible to respect or understand the kind of purity and autonomy and neutrality of the white cube space in this space. But she also determined to restrict the amount of work that she shipped from London. So she made a small number of paintings, works that alluded to paintings, in her studio with her assistants to go out, minimal transport, not the kind of mega lorries that she was used to. And she asked the museum she gave them a list of raw materials or bought materials, because she never used raw materials, and she made the work in situ with her team. And she made it with a deadline, but when I visited her to talk to her about Schwitters, and I asked her about this project, she confessed to me that she didn't even know whether she would finish the work on time. And she obviously was very excited about that notion of indeterminacy, but she was contemplating possibly constructing it in public. I asked her not to do that during the vernissage, but there was this idea that she would go on making, with the public in the space. And I think the other thing she was challenging was actually that whole notion that the work of art should exist in perpetuity. And she had lived with that sense of impermanence for decades. None of her work survived, or very few from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. Her whole oeuvre, the retrospective is photographic. And I think she was beginning, on reflection, to see the value in that. We're living, why make things and lock them up for nobody to see and keep them air-conditioned when they need to breathe and age and be touched and maybe destroyed? The cycle of making, remaking, repair was so hard won in her work. And I found, the possibility of not to finish, to leave undone, the uncertainty principle. She was definitely thinking about that big time again. And I mean, we'll never know, but I think she was on the brink of a kind of return. But, you know, with a channeling Louise Bourgeois, it wouldn't be a return. It would be an I do, I redo, I undo, and then I redo. Anyway, she was, just to finish, and I'm sure Fabian will back me up on this, she took no truck in nonsense. She broke all the rules, but she had some very, very tight rules of her own, which I loved. She was often very angry about mankind, man's inhumanity to man. She was very, very short-tempered about carelessness, unless it was intended. You know, she worked with carelessness. She set it up, but carelessness itself had no meaning for her, or lack of rigor. She was utterly rigorous, ruthlessly rigorous, I would say. She found much of life absurd, but I think it was like the absurd, it wasn't the absurd, she didn't despair at the absurd. She kind of found it hilarious and full of hope, because the absurdity prompts change. And she loved looking at the overlooked. And I think that's why she spent so many hours looking out of the window at night at the railway line and thinking about rail engines as boxes and people as things that walked. You know, that sort of exercise in looking, it was a never-ending delight and value. And she was unashamed, I think, to live in a work framed by completely unresolvable paradoxes. So you could never say what the work is about. It's about probably totally incompatible things. And I think she would celebrate the damage. She would love to see the bird shit on the work. She'd love to see the way the rain is impacting on those, what are they, canvases, hoardings, plaques. She would caress the wounded. She would strive to remake and redo it. But she does leave us all with an extraordinary body of work. Extraordinary was one of her favorite words, so I think I can use it. And of course, words, many, many words. Her words are the undiscovered joy of her career, and they we can take into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Frances, for this lecture. I will start with an apologize, because I feel so at home and so in a family. I have even introduced yourself, and you have done it. I noticed that the moment I seated, but of course, you have noticed Frances is an incredible art historian, curator, fantastic shows, and the former director of the Tate Modern, of course. Sorry for that. But yes, you make us feel like in a living room at home with Fabian, with you, and remembering Phyllida and going through the journey all together through this fantastic life. And of course, you also make me think about how Phyllida was so good in communication, and because she was a teacher of her life and this facility of communicate. And I would like to thank you for your lecture, because you have also this ability. And yes, it was a fantastic journey with you, with Johan. And I just want to take advantage of me and ask the first question for you, if you can explain from your point of view why you think it has been important for Phyllida to include a drawing room in this particular exhibition.
Okay, well, that's a lovely question. I didn't even allude to her drawings, but I think drawing was incredibly important to Phyllida throughout her professional practice. And I'm reminded by your question of early memory, or an early experience she had when she was at art school. And one of the things that students all had to do at that time was that they had to draw from the living model. It was incredibly important to master a particular way of drawing. And there were techniques for doing it, for marking up, and there was a sense that you could teach people and that they could master the technique and they could do good drawings. And Phyllida found that incredibly difficult. And when asked to explain why she found it so difficult, and I think obviously tutors would stop her and say, no, that's not right. This is the way you must do it. Take the measurement here. And she described to me, and probably others, the way that what was happening to her when she was looking at the model is that she found that the images of the students' easels and the form of their notepads just as interesting as the figure. And she found it fascinating. That how can I separate this figure? How can all these other people just look at the figure when actually they're looking through, there's somebody in front of them or there's something on the side? And I think the drawing, her interest in drawing came from that it was, for her, it was an exercise in looking and thinking about looking. And so her drawings are of many different kinds. They're drawings that she's looking out on a landscape and notating it in her own way. I mean, I don't know many drawings that are kind of like traditional figurative drawings, but there are other drawings that are clearly thinking about sculpture or thinking about objects by other artists. You and I were talking earlier about there's a couple of beautiful small colored drawings, and you mentioned Morandi, and they look like drawings where she's reflecting on sculpture. But I think many of them are thinking exercises. Tony Cragg, who I showed you earlier, he used to describe his sculptures as thinking objects. Because for him, they would set up a proposition and they asked you to think about it. I think for Phyllida, drawing was a kind of way of thinking. And she would draw her drawing, she would accompany the work. So many of her drawings are of sculptures. So their way of processing. There's a beautiful drawing that looks very like the sculpture called Hollow. And and in the drawing you get more of a sense of hollowing being a hollow, like a dip in the landscape, but also something that you hollow out. So I think often there were things, maybe, I'm sure, Fabian, you know much more about this than I do, that you get the sense that she's had an idea in a sculpture, but then the development of the idea is in a drawing, or vice versa. So it was a continuous conversation between the different media. And that speaks also to the fact that Phyllida, as I showed you, that Phyllida had no respect. No, she respected and understood the boundaries between disciplines, that there was a genre, there was something called painting, and there was something called sculpture, and there was something called drawing, just as she understood that there was film. But in her own work, her own work was a mediation on all those types of practice. So there was respect for the borders, but that she didn't restrict her own work to one of those areas. And so I think drawing was a place where you saw a lot going on that you don't necessarily see in a finished work. And certainly when I've looked at earlier drawings, I see quite a lot of, it seems to me, dialogue with her contemporaries that doesn't always come through in the work, but she might have been processing what she was seeing in another person's work. Victor Willing, for example. I mean, they're drawings that seem to evoke painters that you wouldn't at first sight think that she would have been aware of or interested in. Nicholas Pope, yeah. I think she was very, very aware of other artists in a really amazing, brilliant way.
Yeah, and her talking was like, her conversation and talking was sculpture, wasn't it?
Yeah.
She was very, very intelligent. It's funny saying that about my wife, but I'm talking about, it was something that struck me right from the beginning when we first started going out together. And I kept saying to her, blimey, you know everything, you know. And I think she'd talk in such a way that even if she didn't necessarily know all the details about a subject that she was talking about, she'd put it across in such a way that it was very convincing, and it was certainly very formed as an idea, and the idea being formed was great, even if it was sidestepped from where it started.
And I wonder, it's interesting that you say already formed, because I got the idea when I was talking to her that she talked and talked. She was amazingly articulate, wasn't she? And sometimes I got the idea that I'd ask her a question and she would talk herself into the answer. And it would be often a long journey through passaging through different words, where you could almost see her constructing the answer, like really thinking that words were like the building blocks of the answer. And she often got to a point in talking that I don't think she could necessarily have anticipated at the beginning. So I think language was really important to her, thinking through a problem. Drawing was, but I think talking about it was as well. Because it was often like there was a moment of discovery in the conversation.
Yeah, and the drawings that you're talking about, quite often, as you'd know, they were sort of like descriptions to herself of what she wanted to do.
Yep.
Other ones had sort of taken off in another direction and became more divorced from reality and became things in themselves and not descriptions.
But I think disagree. I think she found value in those different types of drawing, didn't she?
Oh, yeah.
They did different things for her.
Yeah, yes. They were both equal, but they had different purposes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge body of work in drawing, isn't there?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the whole, really years and years of drawings.
Yes, but we'd sit round on the other side of that picture. It may not have been me. Usually it's me sitting on the other side of that table. And we're just going round and round in circles about crazy ideas that you might be able to home in on something of reality in the end, But, the subjects were very diverse. But I think that's the way she operated, but in a way we had I'm not trying to sort of draw it away from her, but we in the house, we had very much a sort of joint intelligence going on, and it would batter across that big table.
But I think what you're saying is it's a very important point. It's a little bit like the way she created conversations in her own work. She was not an artist who proceeded without conversation. So your conversation with her over many years was incredibly important because she wasn't a monologue. She wasn't Giacometti who went into his studio and everything focused in on there. It was much more expansive, and certainly whenever I spoke to her, she was incredibly interested in the news and me and my kids, and how did she have time to be interested in everybody? I don't know, but she had a very capacious brain, but I think that's one of the reasons that so many people regard Phyllida as key in their lives, even though they were very marginal to her, because she had a way, an ability to say things that maybe they weren't profound in it, but they started off a reflection in people's minds. They were very important.
Yeah. And I think the background to all that was her own family, actually, her parents and her brothers and sisters, who very marked, the different kind of intellectual atmosphere that you gather from that situation, you know, and I think, you know, some of her relatives were quite like that as well, you know, so it's quite scientific, in fact.
Yeah, but also deeply cultured.
Yeah.
I mean, for those of you who don't know, she did come from a very erudite family, granddaughter of Darwin or great-granddaughter?
She was a great
Great-great-great-granddaughter. And you know, occasionally she felt a little bit guilty, or she expressed a feeling of guilt, or no, she expressed the feeling of, she knew she was very privileged in her upbringing in terms of the quality of her education, but also the way that her parents had taken her to museums and galleries. And she did know a lot. And but the first time but she was a little bit embarrassed of it. The first time I visited, and I think she'd just been having a cup of tea, probably with you, and the mug that she was drinking from was obviously a mug that had like a Darwin logo on it. And she saw me looking at the mug, and she put her hand over the logo, and I said, "Don't worry." But I think she had this very strong, very cultured, very distinctive foundation, and also a kind of she knew great houses. You know, she had a love of domestic architecture that doesn't speak of being brought up in a tiny little council estate. It speaks of an understanding of, you know, how shutters work and grand pianos open and stairs go up to attics and rooms are dark and they're chamber pots. It was such a rich environment, and you know, in a way, how amazing that all that channeled into her work.
Thank you, Fabian. ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta? Estamos todos, bueno, I think we are all moved and emotion because of the moment right now, I feel, and I really thank you again for your presence and your generosity for being here and sharing your memories with us.
No, thank you, Fabian.
Fantastic.
It's wonderful. Yeah, we'll have a cup of tea one day. We'll look out of the window and talk about what we see. But for those of you who don't know, I should just also say that Fabian is a very renowned, well, maybe not renowned because you haven't yet had your career peak, but Fabian is a painter and sculptor, so the conversation has been a real one between their work, not just a verbal one, which I think is obviously mutually enriching.
Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you for coming again. Well, actually this lecture is being recorded, so it will be available for everybody, and it will be as an oral memory for us, as well as part of the Dedicó history as well. So thank you everyone for coming.